to prevent A. Imminent death or great bodily harm to herself, or B. The imminent commission of burglary, murder, or aggravated battery against herself. The crime of murder is defined as the intentional, unlawful killing of another by an act imminently dangerous to another and demonstrative of a depraved mind without regard.
Netflix's The Perfect Neighbor tells the story of Ajike Owens, a mother of 4 who was shot and killed by her neighbor in Marion County, Florida. But what the docuseries doesn't fully capture is the devastating reality of what AJ's children witnessed that night, and the months of escalating tension that led to this tragedy. Before we continue into what Netflix didn't show you, I need your help spreading this story. Hit the like button, subscribe, and share this video. Every share could help someone recognize warning signs of escalating neighbor conflicts before they turn deadly. Drop your city and time zone in the comments. This helps me publish these investigations when they'll reach the most people and create real awareness about protecting vulnerable families. My mission is simple. Tell the complete stories mainstream media won't. Stories about mothers like AJ who needed protection but didn't get it. Each investigation isn't just about tragedy. It's about learning to recognize dangerous patterns before it's too late. Watch other cases on this channel. Understanding these warning signs could help you protect a family in your community one day. Thank you for seeking justice with me. Welcome to True Crime Buff HQ. I'm bringing you the full story Netflix's The Perfect Neighbor left out. Not just the courtroom verdict, but the months of harassment, the racial hatred, and the 4 children who watched their mother die. This case involves gun violence, child witnesses, and racial violence. Support resources are linked below. This is the story of how children playing outside became a mother's last stand. Ajike Chantrell Owens, known to everyone as AJ, was 35 years old when her life was taken. But to truly understand this tragedy, you need to know who she was as a mother. AJ was raising 4 children in Ocala, Florida. Those who knew her described her as fiercely protective, the kind of mother who would do anything to keep her kids safe and happy. She worked hard to provide for them, and her world revolved around their well-being. In 2023, AJ and her children were living in a neighborhood that should have been safe. A place where kids could play outside, ride bikes, laugh with friends. That's all AJ wanted for her children, a normal childhood. But in the months leading up to June 2nd, that simple dream was becoming increasingly difficult. Her neighbor, Susan Lorincz, had been complaining about the children playing near her property. What started as minor disputes was about to escalate into something unthinkable. AJ had no idea that standing up for her children's right to play would cost her everything. And her 4 kids had no idea they were about to witness their mother's final moments. To understand how a mother ended up shot through a locked door, we need to go back to late 2020. That's when Susan Lorincz moved into the neighborhood, right next to AJ Owens and her 4 children. At first, it seemed like typical neighbor dynamics, but within months, something darker began to emerge. In early 2021, Susan Lorincz made her first call to police about AJ's children. Her complaint? They were playing too close to her property, making too much noise, being kids. But this wasn't a one-time frustration. Over the next 2 years, Lorincz would call law enforcement approximately 6 times, all about the same thing. AJ's children. Let me be clear about what we're talking about here. These weren't calls about vandalism or destruction. These were calls about children. Playing outside, riding bikes, laughing. The normal sounds of childhood that most neighbors would simply tune out or even enjoy. But for Susan Lorincz, it became an obsession. The complaints escalated. In 2021, Lorincz claimed that one of AJ's children had tried to put a dog in the bed of her truck. Whether this actually happened or was a misunderstanding, we don't know. but it added fuel to a fire that was already burning. Lorincz began posting "no trespassing" signs around her property. The message was clear. She didn't want these children anywhere near her home. But here's the thing about kids in a neighborhood. They play where there's space. They don't always understand property lines. They're just being children. Ajike, as any protective mother would, tried to navigate this situation. She wanted her kids to have freedom to play, but she also didn't want conflict with a neighbor. It's a balance every parent in America tries to strike. But Susan Lorincz wasn't interested in balance. What happened next crossed a line that should never be crossed. According to reports and witness testimony, Lorincz didn't just complain from a distance. In early 2023, she physically grabbed a tablet from one of Ajike's children. Think about that for a moment. An adult woman taking property from a child who wasn't hers. When you take something from someone else's child, you're not just crossing a property boundary, you're crossing a parental boundary. And for Ajike, this was becoming intolerable. But what makes this case even more disturbing is what witnesses reported hearing from Susan Lorincz during these confrontations. According to testimony that would later emerge in court, Lorincz used racial slurs, including the N-word, when referring to Ajike's children. She allegedly called them black slaves. Let that sink in. These weren't just noise complaints. This wasn't just a cranky neighbor annoyed by kids. This was something far more sinister. A pattern of racist harassment directed at children. For Ajike, every day was becoming a battle. How do you protect your children's right to simply exist in their own neighborhood? How do you explain to a 10-year-old why the neighbor hates them for playing outside? How do you maintain peace while also standing up for your family? These were the impossible questions Ajike faced every single day. By June 2023, the tension had reached a breaking point. 2 years of complaints, 2 years of harassment, 2 years of racial slurs and confrontations. Ajike's children were walking on eggshells in their own neighborhood, and their mother was exhausted from fighting a battle she never asked for. And then came June 2nd, 2023. It was early evening, 8:54 p.m. to be exact. Ajike's children were outside playing in a field near the homes. Just kids being kids on a summer evening in Florida. But Susan Lorincz had reached her limit. At 8:54 p.m., Lorincz called 911. Again. But this time, she didn't wait for police to arrive and mediate. This time, she took matters into her own hands. According to witness testimony, Lorincz came outside and threw roller skates at Ajike's 10-year-old son. Roller skates, thrown at a child. But she didn't stop there. Multiple witnesses reported that she then swung an umbrella at the children, physically threatening them. The children did what any terrified kids would do. They ran home to their mother. They ran to Ajike, crying, scared, telling her what had just happened. And Ajike did what any protective mother would do. She walked over to Susan Lorentz's home to confront her, to demand an explanation, to protect her children from a neighbor who had just physically threatened them. Ajike knocked on Susan Lorentz's door. She had no weapon. She wasn't trying to break in. She was a mother demanding answers about why an adult had just assaulted her children. What happened next would take Ajike's life and leave 4 children without their mother. Because on the other side of that locked door, Susan Lorincz was making a decision that would change everything. June 2nd, 2023, 8:54 p.m. Ajike Owens was walking toward Susan Lorentz's front door. Behind her, 4 terrified children watched their mother go to confront the neighbor who had just thrown objects at them and swung an umbrella in their direction. Ajike had every right to be angry, every right to demand answers, every right to protect her children from an adult who had physically threatened them. But she had no idea what was waiting on the other side of that door. At 8:54 p.m., Susan Lorincz had already called 911. She told the dispatcher that Ajike's children were trespassing, that they were on her property. She wanted police to come immediately. But Lorincz didn't wait for law enforcement to arrive. Inside her home, Susan Lorincz made a decision. She retrieved her .380 caliber handgun. She positioned herself near her front door. And she waited. Outside, AJ reached the front door and began knocking. Witnesses reported that she was yelling, demanding to know why Lorincz had attacked her children. She was angry. She was a protective mother who had reached her breaking point after 2 years of harassment. But here's what's crucial to understand. AJ Owens was unarmed. She had no weapon. She wasn't trying to break down the door. She was knocking and yelling through a locked door. The door remained closed, locked, a physical barrier between the two women. And then, at approximately 9 p.m., Susan Lorincz fired a single shot through that locked door. The .380 caliber bullet traveled through the door and struck AJ Owens in the upper chest. The impact was devastating. AJ collapsed immediately on Susan Lorinc's front lawn. But here's where this case becomes even more heartbreaking. AJ's children, including her 10-year-old son, witnessed everything. They saw their mother walk to that door. They heard the gunshot. They saw her fall. And they were the ones who ran to her side. At 9:01 p.m., just 1 minute after the shooting, a second 911 call came in. This time it wasn't Susan Lorincz calling about trespassing children. This time it was AJ's children, screaming for help. The 10-year-old boy told the dispatcher, "My mother has been shot. Please help. She's not moving." Think about that for a moment. A 10-year-old child making a 911 call, watching his mother die on a neighbor's lawn. This is the trauma that Susan Lorinc's decision created. Marion County Sheriff's deputies and emergency medical services arrived within minutes. They found AJ Owens lying on the ground in front of Susan Lorinc's home, a single gunshot wound to her upper chest. Paramedics attempted life-saving measures. They worked desperately to stabilize her, but the bullet had caused catastrophic damage. The wound was fatal. At 9:26 p.m., just 26 minutes after being shot, Ajike AJ Owens was pronounced dead at the scene. While AJ's children were watching their mother die, Susan Lorincz remained inside her home. When deputies knocked on her door, she opened it and immediately invoked her right to an attorney. But before she stopped talking, she made one critical statement to law enforcement. "I thought she was going to kill me." Let's examine that claim. Susan Lorincz was inside her home. The door was locked. AJ Owens was outside, unarmed, knocking and yelling. There was a physical barrier, a locked door, between them. Susan Lorincz had options. She could have stayed inside and waited for the police she had already called. She could have gone to a back room. She could have continued to keep the door locked and simply not engaged. Instead, she chose to fire a gun through that locked door. When investigators processed the scene, the evidence was clear. The bullet hole in the door showed the trajectory, fired from inside the home, through the door, striking AJ, who was standing outside. There were no signs of forced entry. No evidence that AJ had tried to break down the door. The physical evidence contradicted any claim of immediate life-threatening danger. But the most damning evidence wasn't physical. It was testimonial, and it came from the 4 children who witnessed everything. In the months following the shooting, investigators interviewed AJ's children. What they described was consistent, detailed, and absolutely heartbreaking. The 10-year-old son told investigators that he saw Susan Lorincz throw roller skates at him. He saw her swing an umbrella at the children. He ran home to his mother crying, and then he watched his mother walk to Lorinc's door to confront her. He heard his mother knocking and yelling. He heard the gunshot. He saw his mother fall, and then he held her hand while she died. AJ's other children provided similar accounts. They described the escalating confrontation. They described running to get their mother after being threatened. They described watching the shooting happen. These children, the youngest just 9 years old, became witnesses to their own mother's murder. These children, the youngest just 9 years old, became witnesses to their own mother's murder. In the hours and days following the shooting, Marion County Sheriff's Office detectives conducted a thorough investigation. They collected physical evidence from the scene. They reviewed the 911 calls, both Susan Lorinc's call about trespassing and the children's desperate call for help. They interviewed neighbors who had witnessed the years-long feud. They documented the history of complaints and confrontations. And they listened to the testimony of 4 traumatized children who had watched their mother take her last breath. Susan Lorincz was not immediately arrested. In Florida, the Stand Your Ground law complicates cases like this. The law allows people to use deadly force if they reasonably believe they're in imminent danger of death or great bodily harm, even if they could safely retreat. Lorinc's attorney would later argue that she feared for her life, that AJ was pounding on her door, that she felt threatened, but investigators saw something different. They saw a locked door that was never breached. They saw an unarmed woman who was shot through a barrier. They saw a 2-year pattern of harassment and racial hostility that suggested this wasn't about fear. It was about anger. And they saw 4 children who had lost their mother over a dispute about playing outside. As news of the shooting spread through Ocala and beyond, the community's reaction was swift and emotional. Neighbors who knew AJ described her as a devoted mother who was simply trying to protect her children. They described Susan Lorincz as someone who had been hostile and aggressive toward the family for years. Vigils were held. AJ's family spoke out, demanding justice. They wanted the world to know that AJ wasn't a threat. She was a mother defending her children from a neighbor who had physically attacked them. But the question everyone was asking was, would Susan Lorincz be charged with murder? Or would Florida's Stand Your Ground law protect her? For 4 days, Susan Lorincz remained free while investigators built their case. The Marion County State Attorney's Office reviewed every piece of evidence. They consulted with legal experts about Stand Your Ground. They weighed the physical evidence against Lorinc's claim of self-defense. On June 6, 2023, 4 days after AJ's death, Marion County Sheriff Billy Woods held a press conference. Sheriff Woods announced that Susan Lorincz had been arrested and charged with manslaughter with a firearm, battery, and 2 counts of assault. Not murder, manslaughter. The distinction is critical. Murder requires proof of premeditation or malicious intent. Manslaughter with a firearm in Florida means causing someone's death through culpable negligence while using a firearm. It carries a maximum sentence of 30 years. The state attorney's office determined that while Lorinc's actions were criminal and unjustified, they couldn't prove beyond reasonable doubt that she had planned to kill AJ or acted with premeditated malice. Susan Lorincz was booked into Marion County Jail. Her bond was set at $150,000. She posted bond and was released while awaiting trial. Meanwhile, 4 children were left without their mother. The 10-year-old who made that desperate 911 call. His siblings who watched the same horror unfold, all of them now facing a lifetime of trauma from witnessing their mother's death. AJ's funeral was held on June 10, 2023. Hundreds attended to honor a mother who died trying to protect her children. Her family eulogized her as a fierce protector, a loving parent, and a woman who deserved so much more than the violence that took her life. The neighborhood where AJ's children once played freely became a crime scene. The field where they rode bikes and laughed with friends became a place of trauma. The home where they should have felt safe became a place haunted by the memory of their mother's final moments. But AJ's story didn't end on June 2nd. Her family's fight for justice was just beginning, and the legal battle that would unfold would force Florida and the nation to confront difficult questions about Stand Your Ground laws, racial bias, and what truly constitutes self-defense. Susan Lorincz would have 16 months of freedom before facing a jury. 16 months while AJ's children grew up without their mother. 16 months for the community to demand accountability. And when that trial finally began, the world would be watching. They interviewed every neighbor who had witnessed the years-long feud. They documented every complaint, every confrontation, every racial slur that had been reported. They reviewed Susan Lorinc's history of 911 calls, 6 calls in the months leading up to the shooting, all complaining about AJ's children. And they conducted sensitive interviews with AJ's 4 children. Child psychologists were brought in to help the traumatized kids recount what they had witnessed. The consistency of their testimony was striking and damning. All 4 children described Susan Lorincz as the aggressor that night. They saw her throw objects at them. They saw her swing an umbrella. They ran to their mother for protection, and they watched their mother walk to Lorinc's door to confront her about attacking children. Sheriff Woods consulted extensively with the state attorney's office. The question of charges was complex. Could they prove murder, which requires premeditation or depraved indifference to human life? Or was this manslaughter, a killing that resulted from culpable negligence? Meanwhile, pressure was building. AJ's family held press conferences demanding justice. Civil rights organizations called for Lorinc's immediate arrest. Protesters gathered outside the Marion County Sheriff's Office, holding signs that read, "Justice for AJ" and "Black Mothers Matter." Attorney Ben Crump, who has represented families in high-profile civil rights cases including George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, joined AJ's family. He argued that the 4-day delay in arrest was unacceptable, that if AJ had shot Susan Lorincz, she would have been arrested immediately. The criticism stung, but Sheriff Woods was methodical. He knew that rushing to arrest without sufficient evidence could jeopardize the prosecution. He needed the charges to stick. On June 6, 2023, Sheriff Woods called a press conference. Media from across Florida packed the room. AJ's family sat in the front row, hoping for the word they desperately needed to hear: arrest. After a thorough investigation, Sheriff Woods announced, "We have arrested Susan Louise Lorincz and charged her with manslaughter with a firearm, battery, and 2 counts of assault." The room erupted. Some family members cried with relief that Lorincz would face charges. Others expressed frustration. Why manslaughter instead of murder? Sheriff Woods explained the decision. While Lorentz's actions were unjustified and criminal, prosecutors determined they couldn't prove premeditated murder beyond reasonable doubt. Lorincz hadn't planned to kill AJ that day. She had acted in the heat of the moment, making a catastrophically bad decision to fire through her door. First-degree felony manslaughter with a firearm in Florida is still a serious charge. It carries a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison, essentially a life sentence for someone Lorentz's age. The prosecution believed this charge reflected both the severity of the crime and what they could prove in court. The additional charges, battery and 2 counts of assault, related to Lorentz's actions before the shooting. The battery charge covered her physical attack on the children with the umbrella and thrown objects. The 2 assault counts represented threats made against the children that put them in fear of imminent harm. Susan Lorincz was taken into custody that same day. She was processed, fingerprinted, and booked into Marion County Jail. Her mugshot showed a 58-year-old white woman with gray hair, staring blankly at the camera. The face of someone who had just destroyed multiple lives, including her own. At her initial appearance, bond was set at $150,000. Lorinc's attorney argued that she wasn't a flight risk, had no prior criminal record, and had lived in the community for years. The judge agreed to the bond amount. Within days, Susan Lorincz posted bond and walked out of jail. She would remain free, albeit under court supervision, while awaiting trial. She was fitted with an electronic monitor and ordered to have no contact with AJ's family or any witnesses. The contrast was stark. Susan Lorincz returned to her home. AJ's children would never see their mother walk through their door again. The community's reaction to the charges was mixed. Some praised Sheriff Woods for taking action despite the complications of stand your ground law. Others argued that the manslaughter charge was too lenient, that this was clearly murder. Legal analysts debated whether stand your ground would even apply. Could Lorincz claim self-defense when she was safely inside her locked home? When she fired through a door at an unarmed woman? When she had already called 911 and help was minutes away? These questions would have to wait for trial, and that trial was still over a year away. Susan Lorincz would spend the next 14 months preparing her defense. AJ's family would spend those same months grieving, healing, and preparing to face their mother's killer in court. And the nation would watch to see whether Florida's justice system would deliver accountability, or whether stand your ground would become a shield for violence once again. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. Assistant State Attorney addressed the jury directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a woman who fired a gun through a locked steel door at an unarmed mother of 4. AJ Owens never had a weapon. She never tried to break down that door. She knocked and asked to speak with Susan Lorincz about why she had attacked her children. For that, she was shot dead." The prosecutor walked the jury through the physical evidence. The door, solid, locked, secure. The bullet hole, fired from inside through the door at chest height. The trajectory analysis showing AJ was standing at least 2 feet away when shot. The complete absence of any forced entry or damage to the door. Susan Lorincz was never in danger, the prosecutor continued. She was inside her home. The door was locked. She had already called 911. Help was minutes away. But instead of waiting for law enforcement, she grabbed her .380 caliber handgun and fired through that door. She didn't fire a warning shot. She didn't fire at the ground. She aimed center mass and pulled the trigger. The defense's opening statement painted a very different picture. Lorinc's attorney described years of harassment, threats, and intimidation. Susan Lorincz lived in fear, the defense argued. For years, she endured constant harassment from her neighbors. Loud music at all hours, children running wild, trespassing on her property, threats and intimidation when she complained. The defense highlighted Lorinc's multiple 911 calls, evidence, they claimed, that she had tried to resolve the situation through proper channels. She called law enforcement 6 times in the months before this tragedy. She begged for help. She documented every incident. She tried to do everything right. On June 2, 2023, Susan Lorincz heard pounding on her door. Aggressive, violent pounding. She heard threats. She feared for her life. Florida law is clear. When you're in your home and you reasonably believe you're in imminent danger of death or great bodily harm, you have the right to defend yourself. You have no duty to retreat. That's what Susan Lorincz did. She defended herself in her own home. The prosecution's case began with the first responders. Paramedics testified about finding AJ on the ground, her children surrounding her, desperately trying to help their dying mother. They described the chaos, the trauma, the futility of their efforts to save her life. The medical examiner's testimony was clinical but damning. The bullet entered AJ's upper chest, traveled through vital organs, and caused catastrophic internal bleeding. Death would have occurred within minutes. There was no chance of survival once that trigger was pulled. Forensic experts testified about the door, the bullet trajectory, and the physical evidence. They demonstrated that AJ was standing at a normal distance from the door when shot, not trying to break it down, not physically threatening in any way. The bullet hole's location and angle were consistent with someone simply standing at the door, likely in a conversational posture. Multiple neighbors testified about the long-running feud. Some described Lorincz as paranoid and aggressive, constantly complaining about minor issues and using racial slurs. Others testified about the noise from AJ's apartment and the children playing outside. The picture that emerged was of two neighbors who had reached a breaking point, but only one had a gun. The prosecution played Lorintz's 911 call from that night. The jury heard her voice, the background sounds, the timeline. Crucially, they heard that she called 911 after shooting AJ, not before, not during the confrontation, but after she had already pulled the trigger. Then came the moment everyone had been dreading. Testimony from AJ's children. The prosecution had prepared carefully for this. Child psychologists had worked with the kids. The courtroom was cleared of unnecessary observers. Special accommodations were made. AJ's 10-year-old son took the stand. Through tears, he described that night. He told the jury about Susan Lorincz attacking them with an umbrella and throwing things. He described running to get their mother. He recounted watching his mother walk to Lorintz's door to confront her about attacking children. And then he described the sound, the gunshot that changed everything. He told the jury about holding his mother's hand as she died, about the blood, about begging her to stay with them. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Several jurors wiped away tears. Even the judge appeared moved. This wasn't abstract legal theory anymore. This was a child describing watching his mother die. The defense's cross-examination was gentle but pointed. They asked about the noise levels in the apartment complex. They asked about previous confrontations. They tried to establish that the situation had been volatile and threatening. But nothing could erase the core truth. These were children, and their mother had been killed for trying to protect them. AJ's other children provided corroborating testimony. The consistency was striking. All 4 children told the same story. Susan Lorincz had attacked them. They ran to their mother. Their mother went to Lorintz's door to confront her. Then the gunshot. Then their mother dying in front of them. After days of testimony, the prosecution rested its case. They had presented overwhelming evidence that Susan Lorincz had killed AJ Owens without legal justification. The door was locked. AJ was unarmed. Help was on the way. Lorincz had other options, but she chose to fire her gun. Now it was the defense's turn. They called their own experts to challenge the prosecution's narrative. A defense forensic expert testified that the bullet trajectory was consistent with someone leaning aggressively toward the door. Though on cross-examination, admitted this was speculation without definitive proof. A psychologist testified about Lorintz's mental state. Years of alleged harassment had created genuine fear and anxiety. The defense argued that Lorintz's perception of threat, whether objectively reasonable or not, was what mattered under Florida's Stand Your Ground law. If she genuinely believed she was in imminent danger, the law protected her right to use deadly force. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Susan Lorincz herself took the stand. Dressed conservatively, speaking quietly, she told her version of events. She described years of torment, constant noise, children running through her yard, confrontations that left her terrified. I was scared all the time, Lorincz testified. Every day there was something. Loud music, screaming, children everywhere. When I complained, it got worse. I felt targeted. I felt like they were trying to drive me out of my own home. She described the night of June 2nd in detail. The children on her property, her throwing items to scare them away. Then, she claimed, aggressive pounding on her door. It was violent, she said. Bang, bang, bang. I heard threats. I heard, "I'm going to kill you." I was terrified. I thought they were going to break down my door. Lorincz broke down crying as she described grabbing her gun. I didn't want to shoot anyone. I just wanted them to stop. I was so scared. I thought I was going to die. I fired one shot to make them go away. I didn't know I'd hit anyone until later. The prosecution's cross-examination was surgical. Assistant State Attorney walked Lorincz through every inconsistency, every choice, every moment where she could have done something different. Ms. Lorincz, you had already called 911, correct? Yes. Help was on the way? Yes. Your door was locked? Yes. It's a steel door? Yes. No one was trying to break it down? They were pounding, but no one was actually breaking it down, were they? No, but you could have stayed silent and waited for police. I was scared. You could have gone to a back room? I didn't think. You could have fired a warning shot. I wasn't thinking clearly. But you were thinking clearly enough to aim center mass and pull the trigger. The prosecutor pressed harder. Ms. Lorincz, you've used racial slurs to describe your neighbors, haven't you? Lorincz hesitated. I may have said things in frustration. You called them the N-word, didn't you? Long pause. I don't remember. You told investigators that A.J. Owens was one of those people, didn't you? I was upset. Yes or no? Yes. The prosecutor held up a photo of A.J. Owens, smiling, beautiful, alive. Ms. Lorincz, when you fired that gun through your locked door, did you intend to kill whoever was on the other side? I just wanted them to stop. Did you aim your weapon? Yes. Did you pull the trigger? Yes. Did you know that firing a .380 caliber handgun at someone's chest would likely kill them? Silence. Ms. Lorincz? Yes. I knew it could. The defense tried to rehabilitate their client on redirect, emphasizing her fear, her mental state, her genuine belief that she was in danger. But the damage was done. The jury had heard her admit that she knew the gun could kill, that she aimed it, that she fired it through a locked door at an unarmed woman. Closing arguments brought everything into sharp focus. The prosecution reminded the jury of the children's testimony, the physical evidence, the locked door. Ladies and gentlemen, Susan Lorincz was never in danger. She was angry. She was frustrated. She may have even been scared. But fear doesn't give you the right to kill an unarmed mother through a locked door. A.J. Owens knocked on that door to protect her children. That's what mothers do. They protect their babies. And for that, for being a mother, for standing up for her children, she was shot dead. That's not self-defense. That's murder. The defense made their final stand-your-ground argument. Florida law is clear. When you're in your home and you reasonably believe you're in danger, you have the right to defend yourself. Susan Lorincz believed she was in danger. That belief may have been wrong, but it was genuine. The law doesn't require perfect judgment in a moment of terror. On August 16, 2024, the jury retired to deliberate. They had heard days of testimony, seen countless exhibits, listened to legal arguments. Now they had to decide. Was Susan Lorincz guilty of manslaughter, or was she protected by stand your ground? The wait was agonizing. AJ's family sat in the courtroom, holding hands, praying. 2.5 hours passed. Then the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. 3 months after the guilty verdict, Susan Lorincz returned to Judge Robert Hodges' courtroom for sentencing. The charge, manslaughter in the first degree with a firearm, carried a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison. The question now, how many years would she serve for taking A.J. Owens' life? The courtroom was packed again. A.J.'s family filled the front rows. Her mother, Pamela Diaz, her 4 children now living without their mother. Relatives who had supported them through 9 agonizing months since that June night. They came to speak, to be heard, to ensure the judge understood the magnitude of what had been stolen from them. Pamela Diaz approached the podium first. AJ's mother, now raising her grandchildren, faced the woman who had killed her daughter. Her voice trembled but held steady. My daughter was my best friend. She was a devoted mother who loved her children more than anything in this world. Because of Susan Lorincz, my grandchildren will never feel their mother's embrace again. They will never hear her voice. They cry for her every single day. She described the children's trauma, the nightmares, the therapy sessions, the questions that have no good answers. How do I explain to them why their mother was taken? How do I tell them that someone shot her through a door while she was simply trying to protect them? Other family members spoke. Each painted a picture of AJ, not just as a victim, but as a vibrant woman, a loving mother, a daughter, a friend. They described the hole in their family that could never be filled. The holidays without her, the milestones she would miss, the grandchildren she would never meet. The prosecution urged Judge Hodges to impose a significant sentence, one that reflected the severity of taking a mother's life, the use of a firearm, and the complete lack of justification. They emphasized that Lorincz had been safe behind a locked steel door with police already on the way. There was no imminent threat, no reason to fire that gun. The defense pleaded for leniency. They argued that Lorincz had no prior criminal history, that she had genuinely believed she was in danger, that she had lived in fear in that neighborhood. They asked the judge to consider her age, her mental health struggles, her remorse. Then Susan Lorincz herself stood to address the court. In a brief statement, she expressed remorse. I never intended to kill AJ Owens. I am deeply sorry for the pain I have caused her family and her children. I wish I could take it back. Judge Robert Hodges listened to it all. Then he spoke. His words were measured but firm. This shooting was completely unnecessary. You were behind a locked door. Law enforcement was on the way. This was based more in anger than in fear. He continued. Ajike Owens was a mother protecting her children. She posed no threat to you. Your actions took her life and devastated her family. I hereby sentence you to 25 years in the Florida Department of Corrections. 25 years. Not the maximum, but close. AJ's family wept, tears of relief mixed with grief. No sentence could bring her back, but it was something. Accountability. Justice, however incomplete. Susan Lorincz showed little reaction as deputies led her away. At 60 years old, she would be 85 when released, if she lived that long. The sentence brought closure to the criminal case, but for AJ's 4 children, Isaac, Israel, Titus, and the youngest, the real sentence is lifelong. They lost their mother at ages ranging from toddler to preteen. No amount of justice can restore what was taken from them that June night. The Ocala community rallied around the family. Vigils continued. Fundraisers were organized to support the children's future. AJ's memory became a rallying cry, not just for one family's loss, but for broader conversations about safety, justice, and how we treat each other as neighbors. The case drew national attention, reigniting fierce debates about Florida's Stand Your Ground law. Critics pointed to AJ's death as yet another example of the law being misused, a shield for aggression rather than genuine self-defense. How could someone behind a locked steel door with police already dispatched claim they needed to fire a gun through that door? Advocates called for reforms, clearer standards for what constitutes reasonable fear, restrictions on using stand your ground when the shooter is the initial aggressor, mandatory de-escalation requirements. But in Florida's political climate, legislative change remained elusive. The law that had emboldened Susan Lorincz stayed on the books, unchanged. The racial dimensions couldn't be ignored. A white woman had killed a black mother who was simply knocking on her door to address a conflict involving children. The history of racial slurs, the pattern of complaints, the all-white jury. These elements sparked conversations about implicit bias, whose fear is considered reasonable, and whose lives are valued in the justice system. Ben Crump and other civil rights attorneys emphasized that while the guilty verdict was significant, it was just one case. Across America, similar conflicts escalate to deadly violence too often. The question remained, how many more families would have to grieve before real change happened? Beyond the criminal case, AJ's family pursued civil litigation against Susan Lorincz and potentially other parties. These lawsuits sought financial compensation for the children's loss, money that could never replace their mother, but could provide for their future education, therapy, and needs. But amid all the legal proceedings, policy debates, and national attention, the heart of this story remained simple and devastating. 4 children lost their mother. A family lost their daughter, their sister, their friend. A community lost a neighbor who was simply trying to protect her kids. Ajike, AJ, Owens was 35 years old. She loved her children fiercely. She worked hard. She stood up for what was right. And on June 2nd, 2023, she was killed for knocking on a door. That's the truth we cannot forget. Before we close, I want you to remember something important. Ajike AJ Owens was not just a victim. She was not just a headline. She was not just a case number in the criminal justice system. She was a mother who woke up every morning thinking about her children's futures. She was a daughter who made her mother proud. She was a neighbor who deserved to feel safe in her own community. She was a human being whose life had value, whose dreams mattered, whose presence in this world made a difference. On June 2nd, 2023, she did what any parent would do. She went to address a conflict involving her children. She knocked on a door. She raised her voice because she was frustrated, because her kids had been hurt, because she wanted answers. And for that, for being a protective mother, she was shot and killed through a locked door. The justice system worked in this case. Susan Lorincz was arrested, prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced to 25 years in prison. That matters. It sends a message that you cannot kill someone simply because you're angry, simply because you're afraid of conflict, simply because you view your neighbor as a threat rather than a human being. But AJ's case is not isolated. It's part of a larger pattern. Conflicts that escalate to deadly violence. Stand your ground laws that are misused. Racial bias that influences whose fear is considered reasonable and whose life is considered threatening. We must do better. So what can we do? We can demand accountability. We can support organizations fighting for criminal justice reform and gun safety legislation. We can examine our own biases, the assumptions we make about our neighbors, the fears we allow to control our actions. We can choose de-escalation over confrontation. We can choose empathy over anger. Most importantly, we can remember AJ's children. They are growing up without their mother. If you want to help, support organizations that provide resources for children who've lost parents to violence. Advocate for policies that prevent these tragedies. Speak up when you see injustice. Here at True Crime Buff HQ, we tell these stories not for entertainment, but for justice. We shine a light on cases involving the most vulnerable, because their stories deserve to be heard. Their lives deserve to be remembered. Their families deserve our support. Ajike, AJ, Owens should be alive today. She should be watching her children grow, celebrating their milestones, living her life. Instead, her family visits a grave. Her children cry for a mother who will never come home. We remember you, AJ. We honor you. and we commit to fighting for a world where no other mother dies for simply protecting her children. Rest in power. Ajike, A.J. Owens.